"Oh, you must be the +1," the woman at the registration table said, her smile polite, but her eyes already moving past me, as if I were someone easily replaced, someone unimportant, someone who didn't quite belong here tonight. I looked down at the small white card she handed me, the kind printed in elegant script for a room full of people who mattered, and there it was beneath my name in delicate gray letters. Guest, +1. For a moment, I simply held it between my fingers, feeling the weight of something much heavier than paper settle quietly in my chest. I had spent over an hour getting ready for this evening, smoothing the soft navy fabric of my dress, fastening the pearl earrings my husband once said made me look timeless, brushing my silver hair until it fell just right over my shoulders. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. At 68, you learn that approval is a fleeting thing. But I had believed, perhaps foolishly, that tonight would be different. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my husband's success, a recognition of everything he had built over the past 30 years. And I had been there for every single one of those years. I had stood beside him when the company was nothing more than a rented office space and a folding table. I had listened to his late-night worries, balanced our household when the numbers didn't add up, quietly sold a piece of my own inheritance to keep his first major deal from falling apart. But none of that was printed on this card. Guest, +1. I smiled, because that's what you do when the truth reveals itself in such a small, precise way. You don't argue with it. You don't make a scene. You simply acknowledge it. Thank you, I said gently, pinning the badge to my dress as if it belonged there, as if I had expected nothing more. The ballroom doors stood wide open ahead of me, spilling warm golden light across the marble floor. Inside, soft music drifted through the air, mingling with laughter and the low hum of confident conversations. Waiters moved gracefully between tables dressed in white linens, carrying trays of champagne and carefully plated hors d'oeuvres. It was beautiful, perfect even, the kind of night people remember. I stepped inside slowly, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor, and for a moment, no one noticed me. That, more than anything, told me exactly what I needed to know. I watched as my husband stood near the center of the room, surrounded by colleagues who leaned in just a little too eagerly, their admiration polished and practiced. He looked comfortable there, proud, as if this world had always belonged to him, as if he had built it entirely on his own. Someone laughed at something he said, and he smiled in that familiar way, the one that used to be reserved just for me, back when success was still uncertain and we were still equals in a shared dream. I adjusted the small badge on my chest, feeling its edge press lightly against my skin. Guest, +1. Such a small detail. Such a quiet message. But I had lived long enough to understand that the smallest details are often the most honest. And as I stood there, taking in the soft glow of the chandeliers and the carefully curated perfection of the evening, I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. They hadn't just misunderstood who I was. They had erased me. And the most interesting part wasn't the insult. It was the assumption behind it. They truly believed I would simply smile and stay silent. I moved slowly through the room, not because I felt uncertain, but because I wanted to see everything clearly. When you are no longer rushing to belong, you begin to notice details other people overlook. The way conversations shifted when certain names were mentioned. The way laughter lingered just a second too long when someone made a subtle remark. The way eyes glanced at me, then away, as if confirming something silently agreed upon. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, the cool condensation settling against my fingertips, grounding me in the present moment. No one stopped me. No one asked who I was. That, too, was telling. For years, I had attended events like this standing beside my husband, introduced with quiet respect, acknowledged as part of something important. Tonight, I was simply there. A woman in a navy dress with a polite smile and a name tag that reduced her to an afterthought. I took a small sip and let my gaze drift across the room again until I heard it. So that is her. The voice was low, but not low enough. I did not turn immediately. There is a certain discipline in allowing people to reveal themselves fully before you acknowledge them. I thought she would be different, another voice replied, softer, amused. Well, Richard always had a type, the first one said, followed by a quiet chuckle. Supportive, quiet, safe. The word safe hung in the air like a compliment that had been carefully hollowed out. I turned then, just enough to meet their eyes, offering a small, composed smile as if I had heard nothing at all. 3 of them stood together, 2 women and a man, all dressed impeccably, their posture relaxed with the confidence of people who believe they understood the entire story. One of the women lifted her glass slightly in my direction, her smile bright, practiced. "You must be Richard's wife," she said. "Not Margaret. Not even Mrs. Collins. Just his wife." I nodded gently. "Yes, I am. It is such a wonderful evening, is it not?" she continued, her tone warm in a way that never quite reached her eyes. "We have all heard so much about his journey. It is truly inspiring." His journey. I let that settle for a moment before responding. "Yes," I said softly. "It has been quite a journey." They exchanged a quick glance, subtle but unmistakable, as if my answer had not quite matched the script they expected. The man cleared his throat lightly. "Well, he certainly built something remarkable," he added, with a hint of emphasis on the word he. "Not many people can say they did it all on their own." There it was again. Not loud, not cruel in any obvious way, but precise, intentional. I felt the edge of the name tag against my chest and resisted the small instinct to adjust it again. Instead, I held my glass steady and allowed a faint smile to return to my lips. "Not many people," I agreed. Silence followed, brief but noticeable. They were waiting, perhaps, for something more. A correction, a claim, a defense. But I had learned long ago that truth does not need to be rushed. It only needs to be revealed at the right moment. "Well," the first woman said, breaking the pause with a soft laugh, "it must be nice to be part of all of this." "Part of?" I nodded once more, my expression unchanged. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is very interesting." They smiled again, satisfied, and turned their attention back to one another as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. As if I had confirmed exactly what they believed me to be. I stepped away then, not in retreat, but in clarity. The music continued, the lights remained warm and flattering, and across the room, my husband was still being congratulated, still being celebrated, still standing in a version of reality that had been carefully edited over time. I watched him for a long moment, noticing how easily he moved within it, how naturally he accepted the narrative that had been built around him. And I realized something that settled deeper than the earlier insult, deeper even than the quiet laughter behind me. This was not just about how others saw me. This was about how he had allowed them to see me. I lifted my glass again, not to drink, but simply to hold it there, steady and calm, as the pieces continued to fall into place. Because the truth, once seen clearly, does not create chaos. It creates direction. The closer I stood to the center of the room, the clearer everything became. Not louder, not more dramatic, just clearer, like a photograph slowly coming into focus after years of being slightly blurred at the edges. I moved toward one of the long tables near the back where a few older executives were seated, men who carried themselves differently, less eager, less impressed by the noise of success, and one of them looked up as I approached, his expression shifting in a way that made me pause. Not recognition exactly, but something close to it, something unfinished. "Good evening," I said, my voice even, placing my glass carefully on the table. He studied me for a moment longer than most people had tonight, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching through a memory he could not quite place. "Have we met before?" he asked. It was the first honest question anyone had asked me all evening. I tilted my head just slightly, considering how to answer. "It is possible," I said. "It has been a long time." He nodded slowly, still watching me. But before he could say more, someone behind him spoke up, drawing his attention away. The moment passed, but it left something behind, a quiet ripple in a room that had otherwise been so certain of itself. I stepped away again, letting the movement of the evening carry on around me, and as I did, a memory surfaced, not sharply, but gently, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to return. A smaller room, fluorescent lights. A folding table that wobbled slightly on one side. I could still remember the smell of fresh paint and the sound of my husband pacing back and forth, his voice tight with worry as he talked about numbers that did not quite work and deals that might not come through. I had sat across from him that day, listening quietly, then reaching into my bag and placing the envelope on the table. He had looked at it, confused at first, then startled when he realized what it was. "Margaret, I cannot take this," he had said. But he had. Of course he had. Because at that moment, it had not been about pride or ownership or recognition. It had been about survival. About building something together. I blinked, and the memory faded, replaced once again by the warm glow of chandeliers and the steady rhythm of music. Across the room, my husband was laughing again, his hand resting lightly on someone's shoulder as he spoke, completely at ease in a story that no longer included me. Or perhaps, more accurately, a story that had quietly rewritten my role until I was no longer visible at all. I felt no sudden anger, no sharp wave of hurt, just a steady understanding, settling into place piece by piece. It had not happened all at once. That was the part most people would never see. It had been gradual, subtle, a decision here, a silence there, a correction that was never made, a truth that was never spoken. Until eventually, the version of events that remained was the one most convenient to tell. I reached up and touched the edge of my name tag once more, not to adjust it this time, but simply to acknowledge it. Guest, +1. It was almost impressive in its way. How completely a person could be reduced without a single word being said directly to them. A waiter passed by again, offering another tray of drinks, but I shook my head gently and stepped aside, my attention returning to the center of the room just as the lights shifted slightly and the music softened. There was a subtle change in the atmosphere, the kind that signaled something important was about to happen. Conversations began to quiet. People turned their attention forward. My husband stepped toward the small stage at the front, adjusting his jacket with a practiced ease, his expression composed, confident, ready to speak, ready to be celebrated. I watched him as he took his place behind the podium, the room settling into an expectant hush, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to feel something just beneath the surface. Not anger, not sadness, something steadier than that, something that had been building quietly all along. Because as he prepared to tell his story, I realized with absolute certainty that there was one part of it he would not mention. And that, more than anything else, told me exactly what I needed to do next. The room grew quieter as my husband adjusted the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the space, smooth and confident, the kind of voice people trust without questioning. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his smile warm, practiced, perfectly measured. Applause followed, polite at first, then building as more people joined in, their admiration filling the room like a carefully rehearsed chorus. I stood near the edge of the crowd, my hands resting lightly at my sides, watching him not as a wife would, but as someone observing a performance she had once helped write. When I started this company, he continued, pausing just long enough to let the words settle, I had nothing but an idea and a belief that if I worked hard enough, I could build something meaningful. There it was. The first piece of the story. Clean. Simple. Incomplete. A few heads nodded. Someone murmured agreement. I felt a faint smile touch my lips, not out of amusement, but recognition. This was the version people preferred. The version that fit neatly into speeches and articles and conversations over drinks. The version where success appeared self-made, effortless in hindsight. There were long nights, he said, his tone softening just slightly. Times when I was not sure it would work, times when everything felt like it was on the line. I remembered those nights, not as abstract ideas, but as real moments, heavy with uncertainty. I remembered sitting at our small kitchen table at 2 a.m, going over numbers that refused to balance, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. I remembered the look on his face when he thought he had run out of options. But none of that was visible here. None of it needed to be. Because the story had already decided what to keep and what to leave behind. But I pushed forward, he said, lifting his chin slightly, his voice steady with conviction. I believed in the vision, even when it felt impossible. More applause. Louder this time. A few people stood near the front, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. I watched their faces, their certainty, their admiration for a narrative that felt complete to them. And I understood something else. Something even quieter than the realization that had come before. They were not being unkind. Not intentionally. They were simply responding to the version of truth they had been given. The version he had chosen to tell. My gaze shifted briefly to the side, where a large screen displayed images from the company's early days. There he was, younger, standing in front of that first office, the folding table barely visible behind him. I studied the photograph carefully, noticing what had been cropped out, what had been positioned just outside the frame. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Or rather, I was not. I owe so much to the incredible people who have been part of this journey, he continued, gesturing toward the crowd, acknowledging colleagues, partners, investors. Names were mentioned. Contributions were highlighted. Laughter and applause followed at the right moments, as if the entire evening moved along an invisible script. I listened carefully, not for what he said, but for what he did not say. And when he finished that sentence, when he moved on without hesitation, I knew with absolute clarity that the omission was not an accident. It was a decision, a deliberate one, the kind made quietly over time, reinforced by convenience, protected by silence. I felt the edge of the name tag against my chest again, but this time it did not carry the same weight. It felt lighter, smaller, almost irrelevant, because the truth does not disappear just because it is not spoken aloud. It waits, patiently. And tonight, he said, his voice lifting slightly as he reached the conclusion, we celebrate not just success, but the belief that anything is possible if you are willing to take the risk. The room responded immediately, applause rising again, stronger, more certain, as if they were witnessing the final note of something complete. I joined them, lifting my hands and clapping softly, my expression calm, composed, indistinguishable from anyone else in the room. But inside, something had shifted into place with a precision I could not ignore. Because as I watched him step back from the podium, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, smiling as if nothing had ever been missing, I realized that this was not the moment of loss I had once feared. This was the moment of clarity. And clarity, unlike anger, does not demand a reaction. It demands a decision. The applause faded slowly, replaced by the soft hum of conversations restarting, glasses clinking, chairs shifting as people leaned back into their comfortable roles within the evening. My husband stepped down from the stage, immediately surrounded by a small circle of admirers, their voices overlapping in praise, their expressions bright with approval. I watched him for a moment, not with longing, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of quiet detachment that surprised me in its steadiness. It was not that I no longer recognized the man standing there. It was that I finally understood the version of him the world had chosen to believe. I turned slightly, stepping away from the center once more, allowing the movement of the room to carry on without me, when I heard another voice behind me, softer this time, but sharper in its intent. I always wondered how he managed to stay so focused all those years, a woman said, her tone thoughtful in a way that suggested she already believed she knew the answer. Not having distractions. There was a pause, followed by a quiet laugh, the kind meant to be shared only among those who considered themselves perceptive. Well, another voice replied, it helps when everything at home is taken care of. Some people are just suited for that role. I did not need to turn to know they were speaking about me. The words were not cruel enough to be called an insult outright. They were polished, softened at the edges, wrapped in the language of compliments that had been carefully adjusted over time. But the meaning remained intact. Useful. Supportive. Background. I let the silence stretch for just a moment longer before turning to face them, offering the same composed smile I had worn all evening. Two women stood there, both elegantly dressed, their posture relaxed, confident in the safety of their assumptions. It must have been very comfortable, one of them added, her voice gentle, almost sympathetic, being able to focus on family things, while he built everything. Comfortable. I considered that word carefully. The years of uncertainty, the careful budgeting, the quiet decisions made behind closed doors so that the business could survive another month, another year. Comfortable was not the word I would have chosen. But I did not correct her. Not yet. Everyone plays their part, I said softly, my tone even, giving nothing away. They nodded, satisfied with the answer, as if it confirmed exactly what they had already decided was true. One of them tilted her head slightly, studying me with a faint curiosity. You must be very proud of him, she said. I held her gaze for a moment, allowing the question to settle fully before answering. Yes, I replied. I am. And I meant it. Pride does not disappear simply because it has been misplaced. It changes shape. It becomes something quieter, more complicated, something that no longer depends on being acknowledged. They smiled again, their attention already beginning to drift elsewhere, their interest in me fading as quickly as it had appeared. I stepped away once more, moving toward the far side of the room where the lighting was softer, the conversations less urgent. And as I did, I felt something else take its place beside the clarity I had already found. Not anger, not even hurt. Something more precise than that. Understanding. Because for the first time, I could see the pattern in its entirety. It was not just the name tag, not just the conversation, not even the speech. It was the accumulation of small choices, repeated over time, each one subtle enough to go unnoticed on its own, but together forming a narrative that no longer included me as anything more than a quiet support system. I paused near a small table, resting my fingertips lightly against its edge, feeling the smooth surface beneath my hand. Across the room, my husband was still speaking, still laughing, still existing within a version of reality that had been carefully curated for him. And I realized something that settled deeper than anything that had come before. He was not the only one who had allowed this story to be told. I had allowed it too, not through action, but through silence, through patience, through the belief that time and loyalty would speak for themselves. I straightened slightly, lifting my gaze once more, my posture calm, composed, unchanged to anyone who might glance in my direction. But inside, something had shifted with quiet finality. Because once you understand the story being told about you, you are no longer bound by it. You are free to decide how it ends. I did not move right away. Instead, I remained where I was, letting the rhythm of the room continue around me. But something inside me had already stepped outside of it. The music sounded softer now, the laughter more distant, as if I were no longer standing inside the same story everyone else was enjoying. I reached up once more and slowly removed the name tag from my dress, my fingers careful, deliberate, as if the small motion itself carried meaning. I held it in my hand for a moment, looking down at the words printed so neatly, so confidently. Guest, +1. Then I folded it once, gently, and placed it on the table beside me. Not discarded, not rejected, just set aside, because it no longer applied. As I lifted my gaze again, I noticed the man from earlier standing a few feet away, the one who had almost recognized me. He was watching me now, not with curiosity, but with something closer to certainty, as if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. "Margaret," he said, this time not as a question, but as recognition. I turned toward him fully, offering a small, composed smile. "It has been a long time, Daniel," I replied. His expression shifted immediately, the casual politeness replaced by something sharper, more respectful. "I thought it was you," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice slightly. "I was not sure at first. It has been, 15 years? Almost," I said. "Time moves quickly." He nodded, glancing briefly toward the center of the room where my husband still stood surrounded by admiration. "I had no idea you would be here tonight," he added. I followed his gaze for a moment before answering. "Neither did they," I said quietly. That seemed to confirm something for him. He exhaled softly, a faint shake of his head betraying his disbelief. "They really do not know, do they?" he said. Not a question, a realization. I met his eyes, calm, steady. "No," I said. "They do not." Daniel let out a quiet breath, then gave a small, almost incredulous smile. "That explains a lot," he said. There was a pause, brief but full, the kind that carries unspoken understanding. He looked back at me, his tone shifting again, more serious now. "Are you planning to correct that?" he asked carefully. I considered the question, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood the weight of it. Correction implies urgency, reaction, emotion. What I felt now was none of those things. "Not immediately," I said. "Timing matters." He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if recognizing something in my response that others would miss. "It always did," he said. "You were the one who understood that better than anyone." I allowed a faint smile to return, though it did not reach my eyes. "Some lessons stay with you," I replied. Across the room, I noticed a shift beginning to form again, subtle at first, but unmistakable. A member of the event staff approached the stage, adjusting the microphone slightly, speaking briefly with one of the organizers. The evening was not finished yet. There was another segment to come. Another moment of attention. Daniel followed my gaze and seemed to understand immediately. "They are about to open the floor," he said quietly. "A few remarks from senior partners, maybe a surprise speaker or two." I nodded once, the pieces aligning with quiet precision. That makes sense, I said. He hesitated for a moment, then added, if you choose to say something, people will listen. I looked at him, not with doubt, but with calm certainty. I know, I said. And I did. Not because I needed their attention, but because I understood something far more important. Attention is not power. Truth is. I glanced once more toward my husband, watching as he laughed again, completely unaware of the shift that had already begun to take place beneath the surface of his carefully constructed world. Then I straightened slightly, my posture effortless, my expression unchanged, and took a slow step forward. Not toward him. Not yet. But toward the moment that had been quietly waiting all evening. Because the difference between being overlooked and being underestimated is simple. One is an accident. The other is an opportunity. The subtle shift in the room became more defined as the event coordinator stepped onto the stage, her voice warm and practiced as she thanked everyone for attending and began introducing the next segment of the evening. Conversations quieted once again, chairs angled toward the front, attention drawn forward with a natural ease that comes from habit rather than instruction. I moved closer, not hurried, not hesitant, simply aligning myself with the direction the night was already taking. There is a difference between stepping into a moment and forcing one, and I had no intention of forcing anything. Daniel remained a few steps behind me, his presence steady but unobtrusive, as if he understood that what was about to happen did not require assistance, only witness. We would now like to invite a few key voices to share their thoughts, the coordinator said, glancing down briefly at her list before continuing. Names were called, one after another, each person stepping forward with practiced remarks, offering praise, recounting milestones, reinforcing the same narrative that had been repeated all evening. I listened carefully, not for validation, but for consistency. And it was there, in every speech, in every carefully chosen word. He built it. He led it. He made it possible. The pattern held without interruption. Until it did not. The coordinator paused briefly, her eyes scanning the room once more, as if considering something not written on the page in front of her. And if there is anyone else who would like to share a few words, she added with a polite smile, we would be delighted to hear from you. It was a small opening. Unplanned. Optional. The kind of moment most people would ignore, out of courtesy or uncertainty. I did neither. I took a single step forward, then another, my pace unhurried, my expression calm, as if this had always been part of the evening's design. I could feel the shift in attention before I reached the stage, the subtle turning of heads, the quiet recalibration of interest as I moved into a space where I had not been expected to stand. The coordinator looked at me briefly, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she offered a polite nod and stepped aside, allowing me access to the microphone without question. That, too, was telling. I reached the podium and rested my hands lightly against its surface, the polished wood cool beneath my fingertips. For a moment, I said nothing. Not out of uncertainty, but because silence, when used correctly, has its own gravity. The room settled. Conversations stopped completely now. Even those who had not noticed me earlier were paying attention. I lifted my gaze slowly, letting it move across the audience, not searching, not avoiding, simply seeing. And then, briefly, I looked at my husband. His expression had changed, just slightly. Not fear. Not yet. But something close to confusion, as if a detail in the evening had not aligned with his expectations. I offered him a small, composed smile before returning my attention to the room. Good evening, I said, my voice steady, clear, carrying easily without force. No introduction followed. No explanation. I did not tell them who I was. I did not need to. Instead, I allowed a brief pause, giving the room time to settle into the sound of a voice they had not expected to hear. It is always interesting, I continued softly, to listen to a story being told from beginning to end. A few people shifted slightly, uncertain where this was going, but no one interrupted, especially when that story is about something you remember very differently. The words were simple, measured, not accusatory, not emotional, but they carried weight, the kind that does not come from volume, but from certainty. I let the silence return for just a moment, long enough for the meaning to begin to take shape. Across the room, I could feel attention sharpening, curiosity replacing casual interest. Because something had changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. The narrative they had accepted without question was no longer moving in a straight line. And as I stood there, calm and composed, I understood with complete clarity that the moment I had been waiting for had not been created by force or timing alone. It had been created by patience. And now, it belonged to me. I let the silence stretch just a moment longer, not to create discomfort, but to allow the weight of what I had said to settle naturally, without force, without urgency. Then I continued, my tone unchanged, calm and deliberate. Stories have a way of becoming simpler over time, I said, my gaze moving gently across the room, meeting eyes that were now fully attentive. Details are refined. Complications are removed. And eventually, what remains is something clean, something easy to repeat. A few people shifted slightly in their seats, their expressions no longer casual, but engaged, searching. There is nothing wrong with that, I added softly. It is human nature to prefer clarity over complexity. I paused briefly, allowing a faint, almost reflective smile to appear. But sometimes, in the process of simplifying a story, we forget that it was never built by one person alone. The room remained still. No interruptions. No whispered side conversations. Just quiet attention, held steadily in place. I rested one hand lightly against the podium, not for support, but as a point of grounding. 32 years ago, I continued, there was no stage like this. No recognition. No audience. My voice remained even, almost conversational, as if I were sharing something ordinary. There was a small office with fluorescent lights, a folding table that did not sit quite evenly, and a man who believed he had an idea worth pursuing. A few heads turned slightly toward my husband, then back to me, the connection beginning to form. What he did not have, I said gently, was enough capital to keep that idea alive. I let that sentence rest for a moment, not emphasizing it, not repeating it, simply allowing it to exist. That is where the story usually skips ahead, I continued, to the part where things begin to work. A faint shift moved through the room now, subtle but undeniable. People were listening differently, more carefully. But before anything worked, I said, there were choices that had to be made quietly. Decisions that were not announced, not celebrated, not even discussed beyond a small kitchen table late at night. I could feel the attention narrowing, focusing. An inheritance, I said simply, set aside for security, for the future, used instead to keep a company from closing its doors before it ever had a chance to open them properly. No accusation, no raised voice, just a statement, placed carefully where it could not be ignored. I glanced briefly toward my husband again, not to confront him, but to acknowledge his presence within the truth I was unfolding. His expression had changed further now, the confidence softened, replaced by something less certain, something searching for footing. I returned my gaze to the audience. There were no headlines about that. I continued. No applause. No recognition. A faint pause. And that was never the expectation. I straightened slightly, my posture still relaxed, my voice still controlled. Because when you believe in something, truly believe in it, you do not invest for credit. You invest for possibility. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. No one moved. No one spoke. So yes, I said softly, this is a remarkable story. I let a small, composed smile return. It is just not a simple one. Silence followed again, deeper this time, not empty, but full, as if the room itself was adjusting to a version of reality it had not prepared for. And as I stood there, calm and unmoved, I understood that the shift was complete. Not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. Because once the missing pieces are placed back into a story, it can never return to the version it once was. I let the silence remain for a moment longer, not to hold their attention, but because there was nothing left to rush, nothing left to prove through urgency or emotion. Then I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the end of something that had been quietly unfolding for years. That is all I wanted to say, I added gently, my voice steady, free of tension, free of any need for reaction. I stepped back from the microphone without waiting for applause, without searching for approval, and for a brief second, the room did not respond at all. No clapping, no murmurs, just stillness. It was not confusion. It was realization. I could see it in their faces now, the careful recalibration of everything they had accepted so easily just minutes before. Some glanced toward my husband, others looked down, as if reconsidering conversations they had already had, assumptions they had already made. The narrative had shifted, and with it, the balance of the room. I walked down from the stage at the same measured pace I had used to step onto it, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. No one stopped me immediately, but the space around me felt different now, not because I demanded it, but because it had adjusted on its own. Daniel was the first to meet me as I stepped away from the final row of chairs, his expression no longer uncertain, no longer searching. "You did not just correct the story," he said quietly. "You restored it." I offered a faint smile, the kind that does not linger. "It was never lost," I replied. "Just incomplete." He nodded once, understanding more than most in that room ever would. Behind him, I could see movement beginning again, but it was slower now, more cautious. Conversations resumed, but in lower tones, as if people were suddenly aware that words carried more weight than they had assumed. And then, finally, I felt it. My husband approaching. I turned before he reached me, not out of anticipation, but because I had already felt the shift in the air around him. Up close, the confidence he had worn so easily on stage was no longer as steady. It had not disappeared, but it had changed, softened at the edges by something unfamiliar. "Margaret," he said, my name sounding different now, as if it had regained a meaning he had not used in a long time. I met his gaze evenly, offering no resistance, but no invitation either. "That was unexpected," he continued, his voice controlled, but not as certain as before. I tilted my head slightly, considering his words. "Was it?" I asked softly. He hesitated, just briefly. Not because he did not understand, but because he did. "You could have said something earlier," he said, as if searching for a place to stand within the moment. I held his gaze for a second longer, then allowed a small, calm breath to pass. "I could have," I agreed, "but you would not have listened." The words were not sharp, not accusatory, just precise. He looked at me then, really looked, perhaps for the first time that evening, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the version he had allowed others to believe. "That is not fair," he said quietly, though there was no conviction behind it. I did not argue. I did not need to. Instead, I reached into my small evening bag and removed a single folded document, holding it between my fingers for just a moment before placing it gently into his hand. He glanced down instinctively, his brow tightening slightly as he recognized the letterhead. "I reviewed the original filings last week," I said, my voice even, composed. "The structure has not changed. Not in the ways that matter." He looked back up at me, something sharper now behind his eyes, something closer to understanding. "Margaret," he began, but I shook my head once, not to silence him, but to redirect him. "You do not need to explain anything," I said calmly. "I am not here for that." I stepped back slightly, creating a small but unmistakable distance between us. "I just wanted the story to be accurate," I added. His grip tightened slightly around the document, his expression no longer uncertain, but unsettled in a way he could not easily conceal. Around us, the room continued to move, but differently now, more aware, more observant, as if something invisible had been lifted and everyone could finally see what had always been there. I met his gaze one last time, not with anger, not with regret, but with clarity. Then I turned and walked away, my steps quiet, steady, unhurried, leaving behind not a scene, not a confrontation, but something far more permanent. The truth, once spoken, does not need to stay. It simply remains.